Quill. Peter Quill, wake up.
Holy crap, Drax. You gotta stop doing this, man. It's weird.
We are approaching the quarantine zone.
Crystal Dynamics' Avengers game was immensely disappointing. The potential of what that experience should have been, the spectacle it could have provided, the impact it was meant to have, all of it wasted. I never actually played the game, but by all accounts it was pretty horrific. The grinding, the microtransactions, the games as a service faffery, all of the things that make modern video games nothing but an expensive chore that accomplishes zero were front and center. And then 1 year later, along came Guardians of the Galaxy the game, and inexplicably it was the exact opposite of the Avengers game. It was a focused single-player experience with no microtransactions and no additional downloadable content. It had a beginning, middle, and an end, and you know what that meant? It meant you could actually do other stuff with your life rather than continuously playing the same constant clapped-out content for months on end. I was wary upon first seeing the trailer for Guardians the game, as I was very fond of the MCU version of the characters and the style, and I didn't think I would feel the same way about the game's interpretation. Fortunately, I was massively wrong about that. The characters, the lore, the aesthetic, all of it was so much fun and so much more enjoyable than I thought it would be. Possibly because the developers, Eidos Montreal, seemed to intentionally not make the characters reminiscent of their big screen counterparts at all, except for Groot, because frankly, how many ways are there to design a walking tree monster? I've never read the comics, so I couldn't say if they're accurate to the source material, but honestly it didn't matter to me because the characters were still super interesting regardless and were enjoyable to be around for the duration of the game. The characters in the game come from a very different place to those in the movie. In the game, there has been a great war and the galaxy is seemingly in a period of reconstruction. The Guardians themselves have similar backstories to their movie counterparts, but with the added complexity of each of them having fought in the war separately. So even though the names are familiar, the context is very different. We get snippets of each character's history throughout the game in a way that feels mostly natural. And it does genuinely feel like you get to connect with these people in a way that isn't forced, and that evolves organically over the game's story. The dialogue can get a bit repetitive at times, as the game is trying to reinforce the idea that although this is a team, it is not a cohesive team. So you constantly have Star-Lord yelling, "Guys, we need to work as a team," at least once every skirmish. This works fine in a 2-hour movie, but not so much in a 15 to 20-hour game. But considering how long the game is and how much dialogue it contains, it's impressive that at no point did I get tired of the conversations between the team members. And the plot itself genuinely got its hooks into me. From a relatively humble starting point, it escalated way beyond what I thought would transpire, sprawled into multiple different threads, and yet still managed to wrap up everything in a very satisfying way by the end. If I had to complain about anything, it would be a very petty thing. Like a thing so petty I'm shocked I'm even bringing it up. But I hate the made-up swear words.
Some of my fellow experiments bought into this kind of scud. Let's get the Flark out of here. Oh, Flark. You flarking piece of moldy driftwood! You selfless son of a truck.
They are fucking dumb. I'm not asking that the characters call each other shit biscuits for 24 hours, but the nonsensical Farscape-era curses kept taking me out of the experience because they're used in every second sentence. And if I'm allowed one last petty gripe, it would be the character of Mantis. Not like her actual character, she's cool and funny and interesting, and the direction the writers went with her place in the story is very intriguing. But towards the end she sort of just becomes a convenience. The person that is in the right place just as they're needed, or has some critical piece of info that they probably shouldn't have. Again, it's a minor quibble, but not minor enough that I couldn't not make a note of it.
It's Star-Lord.
Hey, that's right. I forget which version of you I've met. Did you do the thing yet?
What is the thing she is referring to?
No idea.
Moving on to gameplay, this is primarily made up of combat in which you directly control Peter Quill, aka Star-Lord, whilst also giving orders to the rest of your teammates. In addition to this, you can direct them to use their unique abilities to solve light puzzles, or assist you in navigating hard to reach areas. There are also a handful of key conversations you'll have with friends and foes, where you make some critical decisions and have those decisions affect later events in the game. Which all sounds pretty by the numbers, but some of the results that come about because of your actions really are surprising.
The Milano's weapon systems are 4 generations behind, Quill. We need that tech, more than we need some stupid farm animal.
That farm animal could be a Class 3 biohazard. You want to end up in the kiln?
Hide the llama.
What? What about my stuff?
Rocket, I know Corel. I'm pretty sure I can get her to go easy on us about the tech, but a potential biohazard? Man, I'm good, but I'm not that good.
And in a weird way, this is one of the few games where it doesn't feel like the decisions are basic right and wrong answers. Plenty of games say that they don't have right and wrong choices, but that's a lie, because there's always that underlying feeling that you can in fact make a right or wrong decision. But with Guardians that never felt like the case. Every decision felt like the natural choice, with a believable outcome. In terms of the combat, it took me a hot minute to get into it. Your primary weapon is a pair of pea shooters that aren't really that satisfying to shoot and don't have any variety until you get some upgrades later on into the game. You can also use melee attacks, but they are equally unsatisfying, and it wasn't until I'd received a bunch of upgrades, unlocked some new abilities and got mastery of issuing team commands that it finally felt like the combat culminated in an enjoyable way. And maybe that was the intention, to slowly roll out these things to last the duration of the playtime, but I would have liked it if the base layer of shooty combat was a lot more engaging. The only other complaint I have about the combat specifically is that it can sometimes turn into a bit of a spectacular visual mess. Later stages have larger numbers of enemies, some fighting you up close, some shooting projectiles from afar, some with area of effect attacks, and some with bodies big enough to take up half the screen. So it can be a bit difficult during these segments to actually see what is happening. The rest of my complaints boil down to two things: the game sometimes being unclear on what you're meant to do, and that old chestnut, jankiness. Starting with the game's lack of clarity at times, there were several moments where I was either figuratively or literally lost. The game would sometimes give instructions that didn't instruct me on what to do, or would throw so much info at once that it was overwhelming. This goes the same for some of the boss fights. I made a note about a Dweller in the Darkness boss where the game told me to freeze the puddles, but that didn't actually do anything until I started attacking the boss itself. And there were other times where the game would be coy about whether I was meant to be staying in an area to fight, or if I was actually meant to be running away the entire time. More than once I was fruitlessly taking on wave after wave of enemies when all I had to do was exit a room to end the sequence. And then there's the jank. Now, almost every game has some kind of jank to it, and considering how incredibly complex modern games are, we shouldn't be too surprised. And Guardians obviously isn't the only game I've played this year that's had some issues, but they were just too noticeable this time around that I couldn't ignore them. In no particular order, I witnessed finishing moves not syncing up with their animations, Star-Lord getting kicked outside of the level geometry, character weapons showing up in cutscenes when they weren't meant to be there, Groot's voice disappeared for a whole section, a cutscene where the whole team is talking about hiding from nearby enemies, but the enemies were already triggered by their presence, so the whole conversation about being stealthy takes place under a hail of gunfire. One puzzle didn't get solved correctly and offered no way of correcting it, so I had to go back to the previous checkpoint to retry it. 2 instances where a skirmish was over but the game didn't recognise the skirmish was over, so I couldn't proceed to the next area. And the game crashing during the final cutscene, meaning I had to redo the final boss fight, which I really didn't appreciate. Game development is difficult, and I'm sure the team knew of these bugs and just didn't get around to fixing them in time. But there's a general unpolished vibe I got from the game that I couldn't ignore. And it's a shame because the rest of the presentation is done so well. But despite the jank and the issues and the made up swear words and the unengaging combat at the start, I really like this game. It was a thing made to be played, experienced, enjoyed, and finished. It goes out of its way to be creative in parts when it didn't need to be. It feels like the kind of game where the people making it had genuine moments of inspiration and tried to get as many of their cool ideas into it as possible, whilst working within the constraints of AAA game development. Or maybe that's just me being uncharacteristically optimistic, and maybe the development of Guardians of the Galaxy was just as humdrum and mundane as any other modern big budget video game. But I don't think so. And regardless, I still enjoyed it a great deal and think most people will, and I would easily recommend it to anyone willing to give the Guardians a shot.
I can't believe that worked.
Gardeners of the Galaxy.
Explain yourselves.
Hey, World Mind, long time no see. It's me, Peter Quill, Star-Lord.
And, it's Guardians of the Galaxy. Check the addendum.
We need your help.
Pay a fine.
No, of course not. You need to save the
Galaxy cannot be saved, Peter Quill.
What?
A mass delusion.